Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Key Grape Varieties with your host, Jimmy Smith. This is on Cabernet Sauvignon, and this is the advanced version. I'm going to go through a few things, first of all, about Cabernet Sauvignon. As ever, this is in our grape series, so all the key grape varieties of the world, and this is the advanced version. If you are looking at a more basic introductory version of Cabernet Sauvignon, please look at the beginner's version. So first up then, a bit of history about where Cabernet comes from. And being one of the most important grapes in the world and most cultivated black grape varieties, it actually doesn't have a huge amount of backdated history to it. And that's mainly because it is a French-based variety. So most of the grapes that we know with big, extensive history will actually come from places like Italy or Greece and a bit more towards Mesopotamia, Anatolia, etc. So we have the first mention of Cabernet Sauvignon really as recently as the 18th century from around the Gironde area, which is around the Bordeaux region in Aquitaine. So that's our first sort of mention of the variety. Now we know that Cabernet Sauvignon is the offspring of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc, and that's of course where its name comes from, Cabernet Sauvignon. But this discovery was actually remarkably recent as the 1990s. We always believed it was a variety perhaps of a wild base, a wild crossing base, and that's where the Sauvignon name comes from. Sauvignon comes from the French sauvage, which means wild. So they thought it was a wildly crossed variety. But in fact, it is the offspring of Cabernet Franc, which is a Basque grape variety, and Sauvignon Blanc, which is a Western France grape variety. Now, it's important to understand that because if you look at inherent characteristics of these grapes, the unusual thing, of course, is that Cabernet Sauvignon is a black grape, Cabernet Franc is a black grape, and then Sauvignon Blanc is a white grape. But they do share inherent-based green characteristics, such as things like metapyrazines, so things like grassy, nettly sort of characters, certainly for Sauvignon Blanc. Cabernet Franc has a kind of a stalky, herbaceous note, and Cabernet Sauvignon has a minty, green element to it, a green pepper. So they all do have these in common, and that's because they're part of the same family tree for vines. It also means that Merlot is a half sibling. So Merlot has another parent, but it is a half sibling. So of course they are very much heavily related. And these two therefore have similarities. They certainly do, being both black varieties and producing wines with decent tannin levels, Merlots, and good acids below Cabernet Sauvignon, but also having some green notes as well. You can often find with Merlot some sort of minty peppermint characteristic. There is also relations to Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc, which is from Jura. So those two have been related in the past. So there is a link to Cabernet Sauvignon. This is like a niece-nephew relationship of Chenin and Sauvignon with Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon in the Vineyard is a variety which classically hails from the Gironde and Bordeaux, and is found around the world, liking warmer sites. So you'll often find it in moderate, warm, or hot climatic conditions. So in Bordeaux, it's a warm maritime climate, and it likes those conditions. It likes warmth. If there is a little bit of a lack of warmth, maybe the temperatures are a little on the low side, then it will like a terroir, geology, which will help retain warmth, and that's the soils. So soils like big pebbles and rocks and gravel will do very nicely for Cabernet Sauvignon. It also will, it doesn't like too much humidity and moisture. It does suffer with fungal molds quite distinctly. So you will find, in fact, the Cabernet Sauvignon will need to be in areas where the drainage of the soil is important. So that's loose gravel and pebble soils, which is quite classic, for instance, on the left bank of the Bordeaux, on the Haut-Medoc area and Grape specifically. So it quite likes quite good drainage of the soil. It's a fairly productive vine in terms of its vigor, so it grows quite well, quite substantially, but it does bud quite late, so it tends to be secure and safe from spring frosts. Something that's not really an issue generally in the warmer climates, and certainly in areas like Bordeaux, where there's plenty of wind that comes from the Atlantic and the Gulf Stream across the Bay of Biscay. So you'll actually tend to find, therefore, that the budding and the protection against frosts is okay. And it's quite late ripening. So you will find that it will need fairly warm and long conditions. So often Indian-based summers to pick Cabernet. And in Bordeaux, for instance, of course, it's one of the latest grapes to be picked after Merlot and Cabernet Franc. You'll find it being picked quite late, often into October. As mentioned already, it does suffer powdery and downy mildew. It's also quite susceptible to other diseases based around things like Esca. So it's quite susceptible to those. So it does suffer. So in places where there's plenty of rain, such as its homeland around the Gironde in Bordeaux, there are issues with Cabernet Sauvignon. A real big reason why Cabernet Sauvignon is in fact normally found as a blend in this area, because it needs the support of other varieties which are more capable of growing in such wet and cool conditions. And then it produces quite small, compact bunches with small berries, but the berries, therefore, with less juice content, has quite a significant ratio of skin to it. And the skin can have quite a bit of color behind it and good tannic structure. So they're quite thick skinned but small berries found with Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's also pretty hardy throughout the winter. So it's quite safe from winter freezes. That was evident in the 1956 winter freeze down in the southwest of France. In 1956, in February going into March, there was nearly 3 weeks of temperatures below minus 20 degrees Celsius in the southwest of France. Now, one variety which suffered with this was Malbec. It does not do very well in these very cold winter freezes. And in fact, that's what pretty much wiped it out of France. Of course, we still find little pockets of it around Cahors, but there was a lot more of it before 1956. But Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc and Merlot all survive quite nicely as they're quite capable with winter freezes. And of course, the vignerons, the grape growers of this area, after 1956, turned their attention to these winter hardy varieties because there is always going to be a risk planting Malbec where there is an opportunity for a winter freeze. In the winery, because of these small compact berries with quite fleshy skins, you will find lots of color. So the anthocyanin content, that's the pigmentation, is quite intense. It's often kind of a blueberry, bluish, purplish kind of color, the grape, and it produces quite colorful wines that can be quite deep in color as well. The phenolic structure is quite intense because it's a long and gentle ripening for most Cabernet and picked quite late as a late budder. So tannic structure is very intense. So you'll often find Cabernet with high tannins, either quite bitter or can be quite ripe, but they're high. At acid levels, Cabernet does manage to balance its tannin with some rather big, refreshing acidities as well. This combination of color, tannin, and acid is a major reason why Cabernet Sauvignon is in for the long haul. You can really age it over a long, long period of time. It does remarkably well. Now, Cabernet, if it struggles to ripen, so if you, and this is quite common in places like Bordeaux, if you have conditions where there's a bit of a struggle to ripen, you might have some slightly unripe tannins, some little bit of green notes, and stalks have not been ripened too well. When you are extracting from those grapes, you'll have to be quite careful. And in fact, things like pigeage, remontage, débrage, and all the types of methods for extraction actually have to be quite kept in check. It's quite good for oxidation and regulating temperatures to have these extraction techniques, but you do have to be careful because of the level of structure and tannin and bitterness that Cabernet can have, and often stringent character. So extraction techniques have to be very much measured and careful. You'll often find that the wines are worked with contact of oxygen throughout fermentation. That's in things like oak, and then maturation in things like oak, and then, of course, extensive bottle aging. Oxygen is very key to calming down Cabernet's high tannin and acid, and in creating more complexity with a bit of age. So very important for oxidation. So, of course, oak is commonly used. New oak, to give heavy amounts of oxidation, will be used. Yes, a mixture of new and old, or whatever it may be, is used, and of all origins for Cabernet Sauvignon. And of course, because Cabernet is such a powerful monster of a grape with very big acids and tannins and lots of flavor, it will often be blended to produce a wine which is more ready for market, so more ready to be enjoyed. So you'll find Merlot being commonly blended with it just to soften it out. Cabernet Franc, the same, but to add a bit more kind of aromatics. Malbec can help soften it out, but that's moreover in Argentina. Malbec in the southwest of France is quite punchy itself. Petit Verdot is actually blended into it normally as seasoning, the black pepper kind of sort of salt and pepper characteristic that you get of Petit Verdot. So it's not to temper Cabernet, it's just as another blending partner, and Carmenère may also be used. Now, where do we find Cabernet Sauvignon in the world? The biggest plantation, of course, is its home, which is down in the Gironde, which is Bordeaux, but there's also a significant production in the south of France, so around the Languedoc and Roussillon. We find a significant amount, specifically near the city of Carcassonne, in places near Limoux, Cabadet. So there is quite a bit of Cabernet Sauvignon to be found. Chile, propping up with around 42,000 hectares. Some real good examples around Aconcagua, the Maipo, near Santiago. But a lot of Chilean Cabernet, as with Merlot, is to produce quite friendly, big, soft wines. Big branded names like Conchi y Toro, for instance, with their Casalero del Diablo. So you'll find fair big-ish productions of normally quite big and soft wines from Chile. California has a whopping amount, of course, from the Central Valley, big companies like Ernest and Julio Gallo, but of course, very famously around Napa, and really put into the limelight by the 1976 judgment of Paris tasting, which really outlined how good Napa Cabernet can be. So some of the most premium Cabernet in the world comes from Napa in California, but many other parts of California as well. Australia has a significant amount, so you'll find loads around southeastern Australia and Western Australia. Some good Bordeaux blended styles there, down in Mornington Peninsula, and of course South Australia, Coonawarra, some quite mentholated, eucalypt-driven styles there. Spain, it's really become popular, massively around the land of windmills and Don Quixote. So this is Castilla-La Mancha, the Meseta zone, and a big number, a lot of it quite easy, but some of it behind the significant single state Dio Pago classification. So some wonderful wines there. Argentina, of course, quite important, and specifically in Mendoza, where it is used as a varietal, but often blended with Malbec and other varieties. Bulgaria, quite a lot of it as quite friendly styles. And Italy, just sneaking in at the bottom of that list there, around places like Tuscany, Toscana IGT, Bulgari, for instance, and some good stuff around Sicily as well being produced, but mainly the Tuscan stuff, specifically the gravel soils of Bulgari, which is kind of classed as the Bordeaux of Tuscany in that area. So what is it like? Cabernet Sauvignon as a variety will have a lot of character. It's loved in the world because it's very aromatic, but also quite classy. So you'll see here that you'll have things like black currant, you'll have minty or mentholated or eucalypt notes, you'll often find black cherry, green pepper, but not too intensively herbaceous. All of the tannin and the acid and the fruit density of Cabernet often offsets any kind of green pepper or green mint characteristic. So it's actually quite a complex nature, not an overarching, intense nature of the green note. And often things like cigar, cedar, cigar box, smoke, tobacco, and then oak-based characteristics can be found within Cabernet Sauvignon as well. Okay, so that's Cabernet Sauvignon. The big difference between the old world is that you'll definitely have more grip, more tannin, more acid. And in the new world, those characteristics are a bit softer, and the wines are generally a bit plumper and less green. So that is the introduction to Cabernet Sauvignon Advanced version. Once again, if you are looking for a more basic version, please look out for the one that's only 7 or 8 minutes long, which is the beginner's version to Cabernet Sauvignon. Any questions or comments, please pop us those to our social media handles at Wine with Jimmy, at West London Wine, at South London Wine, at Streatham Winehouse. That is my personal, my 2 wine schools, and my wine bar. It's been an absolute pleasure once again. We'll speak to you very soon. Thank you. Cheers.